He thought he knew the shape of his life. That certainty was the kind money buys. Polished floors, guarded gates, the quiet nod of acquaintances who called him Mr. Mendonça with the exact amount of respect his name demanded. Rafael Mendonça had built that life out of deals, late nights, and a stubborn steadiness that made him reliable to the markets and to strangers. He believed he knew the woman beside him as well. Isabela Cavalcante smiled like a spring headline, bright, practiced, exactly the kind of face that showed up in the right photographs. Daughter of a prominent developer, accustomed to the privileges of her station, she moved through Rafael's world as if claiming possession of it. At parties, she floated by, exchanging compliments as currency. To the camera lenses and the world, they were a fitting pair. The entrepreneur who saved the city and the socialite who made it look soft. The truth, as often happens, lived quietly in the corners. Rafael had brought 3 babies into his home because of a promise he made at a graveside. Clarissa, mother to Pedro, Lucas, and Mateus, had died with a request lodged against nothing and everything: protect them. Rafael had honored it with a formality of paperwork he rarely used and an instinctive tenderness he hadn't expected. The triplets arrived like a correction to his life, sudden, candid, and fragile. He had never been a father before. He learned their rhythms from scratch. Someone had to. That someone, for months, had been Marina dos Santos. Marina had a way of making the smallest things feel like sanctuary. She hummed while she folded tiny socks, whispered names in a voice that sounded like a hymn, and rocked the twins with the easy, practiced motion of someone who understood the music of sleep. She was the housekeeper Rafael had hired after Clarissa's funeral, an arrangement he thought practical until he realized she had become indispensable. Marina was patient but worn. She came to work with lines fatigue had carved into her face and left with the softness of baby breath still on her clothes. She had a daughter, Julia, who followed her like a shadow with courage in a small body. Julia would sit on the kitchen step and declare, with the unshakable logic of 5 years, that the babies were hers as much as anyone. Rafael watched Marina and the children for a long time before he understood that what she gave was not paid by any check. It was care. It was the kind of love that did not notice the cost until the bill arrived at someone else's conscience. He noticed other things too. Subtle gestures from Isabela that suggested a different ledger than affection. The way she inspected strollers as if judging potential resale value. The half-concealed sigh when she saw a late-night photo of Rafael with the children. An expression like a coin slipping through fingers. There were the dinners where she laughed too loudly at jokes that had nothing to do with the room. The whispering phone calls she thought were private. The cameras were not his first idea. They grew out of a particular, slow suspicion that refused to be soothed. A dress hemmed in haste. A perfume that left the nursery doors open for longer than necessary. A message Rafael saw once on Isabela's phone, brief and crisp, asking, "Are you sure you want this?" When a man loses sleep over fragments, he either learns to live with the uncertainty, or he finds a way to turn it into knowledge. Rafael fretted, then planned. He wasn't a vengeful man by nature. He was a man who believed in evidence, in the clear arithmetic of facts. So he called his attorney and arranged for discreet cameras in the nursery and the hallway by the back door, places where someone's true hands would be caught, where a glance in a mirror could no longer be misread. He told himself it was about protection. He said it aloud to the vault of his chest, and it sounded sufficient. The first week of footage was small things. Isabela entering the nursery to clip a bow in a baby's hair. A stiff hug that lasted just long enough to be seen. Marina wiping a spill with the gentle focus of someone who refuses to let a child notice. Rafael felt the tape more than watched it, a quiet ache in his ribs as he tracked each motion frame by frame. Then the tapes grew sharper. Voices came loose. The camera captured a word, the tilt of a mouth when a baby cried, the way Isabella's hands hovered, then withdrew from each small face. One morning, a clip of Isabella watching the boys sleep while scrolling her phone, a slow, almost bored study, turned into a cold, clarifying moment when the feed showed a text thread pop up. It flashed for the barest second. We need to move quickly. The simpler we keep it, the better. Rafael froze on that frame, his finger still on the mouse, the world narrowing to that single message. He rewound and watched it again, until repetition made the words meaningless, but the meaning had already settled into his gut. Marina's presence in the footage provided the counterpoint. Her hands were always on the children. She sang to them in the middle of the night and let them sleep on her chest without a thought for the clock. She deflected danger instinctively, stepping between a falling choke of a toy and a baby's neck with the calm of someone whose small heart had known enough fear to act before thought. In a clip that Rafael replayed until his eyes blurred, Marina laughed at a silly face the twins made, and the room warmed around her. There was no calculation there, only a kind of plain, unadorned devotion that felt like the opposite of everything Isabella kept folding up into neat corners. Two hints about something else, another secret hanging in the air, appeared in the footage. The first was small and seemingly innocent. A photograph on Isabella's phone that accidentally made its way onto a live feed when she set her device on the couch and left it unlocked. In that photo, Isabella and Marcos were at a gala last autumn, their heads close, eyes half closed, and a caption Rafael had never seen, one he had to pause and read twice. Night well spent. Marcos was Rafael's oldest friend in the city. He had been at Rafael's side through early ventures and late disappointments. Where Rafael was the steady hand in contracts, Marcos was the laugh that diffused the boardroom tension. The man who drank expensive whiskey with the same casual fondness as tapping a predictable rhythm on a piano. They were practically brothers by history. The second clue came in the cadence of Marcos's behavior. A pull toward the edges in certain rooms. A way he suddenly looked away when Isabella was praised in front of him. A touch on Rafael's shoulder that lingered too long and carried the weight of things unsaid. Once, during a weekend when the nursery was full of visitors, Rafael saw Marcos step outside into the small private garden and put a hand to his mouth as if to hide a secret laugh. Rafael opened his window and saw him alone, phone clutched, eyes wetted with some earnestness Rafael could not read. Those moments, scattered like footprints in fresh snow, mattered enough to Rafael that he catalogued them in his head. He did not like the company of uncertainty. Evidence, he told himself, would be the only thing that could free him. In the middle of the slow accrual of proof, there was a small, stubborn human life that complicated everything further. Isabella began to look tired in a way that had nothing to do with parties. She canceled engagements on a whim, traced the rim of her glass, and sometimes clasped her stomach in a gesture Rafael at first chalked up to indigestion. Marina noticed too, tenderly. One afternoon, she watched Isabella come into the nursery, pale and unsteady, and she quieted like someone who had seen this kind of fragility before. Isabella's face went into a private, guarded expression, and for a second there was a softness under the habitual reserve that made Marina frown in concern. Rafael could have asked directly. He could have confronted and demanded. Instead, he recorded. The camera showed a moment, Isabella leaning down to touch the forehead of one of the boys, then pausing with her hand on the banister as if deciding whether to stay. When Rafael zoomed in on her face, the angle caught a faint vertical line on the inside of her wrist where a bracelet had slept. In the next frame, his breath caught. A private message preview had floated up on her unlocked screen, written in the careful shorthand of intimacy. It read, "Don't let anyone know yet. We have to be careful." Those two fragments. Marcos at the gala with Isabella, looking not like a friend but like someone who knew the taste of a secret, and the message that begged secrecy. sat like an unlit fuse in Rafael's mind. He did not yet have proof, but he had suspicion that fed into another, nastier question. If Isabela were carrying another man's child, could that man be someone close enough to Rafael that the act would feel like a blade in his ribs? The idea was unbearable, but it would not dissolve on its own. He began to stitch the pieces together. The next step Rafael took was more dangerous than the cameras had been. Knowledge is a weapon, and once you have it in a house full of people, someone will instinctively test how it cuts. He planned a dinner, not out of malice first, but because he was tired of not knowing. He invited his mother, Dona Helena, whose presence in the home had been a soft stabilizer since Clarissa's funeral. He invited his sister-in-law and a few close business confidants. He invited Isabela with the casualness of a man offering a ritual of inclusion. He invited Marina and her daughter, slipping a note to Marina that she was welcome as a guest, not merely as help. He invited Marcos too, because he needed him there. Everything about that evening was planned to expose and to test. Rafael would not make accusations in private. He wanted the clarity of truth in lighted rooms. He wanted to see how people moved when all air was clean. He wanted to know who stood where when the music stopped. The week before the dinner, the cameras returned useful footage. A clip caught Isabela speaking to someone on the back patio in the blue hours after midnight. Her voice in the recording was clipped, purposeful. She said, "You know how this must go. We can't make it messy." A muffled male voice answered. Rafael could only catch a syllable, then a laugh from Isabela that had no amusement in it. The tape recorded the sound of a glass setting down and footsteps fading away. Rafael replayed that clip until it became a kind of liturgy. He rewound and listened for clues, tone, cadence, the small tremble in the man's voice. He asked for the frame enlarged. He learned to look for things at the margins. When he slowed another clip, he made out the name Marcos, whispered, like a ghost of a word. The evidence felt thin. It felt irrevocable. The suspicion that his oldest friend might be entangled with the woman who had begun to distance herself from his children felt like a betrayal calculated to fracture him completely. He brought the recordings to one person who mattered, and would understand how to act on them without letting the whole world turn up in chaos: his lawyer. They met in a small office tied to Rafael's downtown practice, a place with thick blinds and chairs that swallowed sound. The lawyer listened, head tipped, fingers pressed to his lips. "You don't want to move too quickly," he said finally, "but you're right to gather what you can. You can't make decisions on suspicion alone. You need undeniable proof if you're going to confront and if you're going to protect the children afterward." "So I plan a dinner," Rafael said. The words surprised him with how small they sounded in the empty room. "I show them what I have. I want to watch their reactions in real time." "It's a performative move," the lawyer admitted, "but sometimes performance clarifies motive. Just be careful with evidence that reveals private communication. There are privacy concerns, and you could expose yourself to claims if you're not meticulous. Make sure the videos are yours, captured in your home with devices you control. If anyone goes legal, you'll need a clean chain of custody." Rafael took precise notes. His world was built on contracts, on the right clause in the right place. He had never felt, though, the way his chest tightened when the notion of exposing someone he loved, someone he'd once thought of as a companion, slipped into being. He wanted the truth, and the truth would be staged under the light of his dining room chandeliers. The week moved toward the dinner, and the house shifted. Flowers were ordered, the table set with a care that made the nursery feel very far away. Isabela told friends she expected a romantic announcement that night, an engagement even, and the whisper in the city's social circle grew like a cloud. Isabela herself seemed to enjoy the attention, arranging her dresses with the precision of a woman who knew how to cue a photograph. Marina did not rehearse for the evening. When Rafael invited her, she accepted with the kind of muttered thanks that meant more to her than it sounded. She wore a corner-worn dress and braided Julia's hair with that rare, sharp focus that makes small people feel dignified. Marina's daughter was effusive and unembarrassed. She chattered about the chocolate cake that would be on the table and how she wanted to put a single candle for the babies, though none of them were old enough for such theatrics. Marcos accepted the invitation as if it were nothing, which was exactly what made him dangerous. He arrived early on the night of the dinner, perfect in a way that suggested rehearsal. When he entered the house, Rafael watched him with an attention he hadn't permitted himself until that moment. Marcos shook hands and hugged on the right sides of shoulders. He laughed at jokes he didn't seem to understand. He took the seat opposite Isabela, and, when their eyes met, something passed between them that Rafael couldn't name. The earlier clues, the message, the photograph, folded themselves like paper cranes in his mind. Before the plates were cleared and speeches started, Rafael slipped away to the study, to the screen, and to the place where he had kept the camera footage. He told no one that he would play his hand that night. His intention was not to destroy Isabela's life for pleasure. It was to find out whether the woman he had made room for in his world was someone who shared his values and whether his friend had kept his own. He started the playback in the living room once the guests had settled into anticipatory smiles. The monitor was connected to the large-screen television in the study where everyone could be coaxed into watching. He had rehearsed the order, a sequence that contrasted care and indifference, that asked a quiet question and then allowed others to answer it with their faces. The first clip was the easiest to watch, a morning when Marina had come in early and changed the boys' shirts with a tenderness that made Rafael's throat ache. The hum of the room softened. Julia's small laugh in the background made the distance between the wealthy table and the story on the screen feel suddenly trivial and obscene. Then, without a break, he played the segments where Isabela's detachment was plain. The way she turned a stroller wheel sharply, the dismissive glance at a boy who reached for her hand. People shifted. Someone cleared their throat. Isabela's smile tightened like a wire. Rafael watched their faces as he played the evidence. The chamber of the dining room unwraps each viewer. Some leaned forward, some crossed their arms as if bracing. When he hit play on the clip where Isabela's phone buzzed and the preview flashed the words, "We need to move quickly," the room went quiet enough to hear a clock tick. Marcos's cup paused halfway to his mouth. He put it down with a small, almost imperceptible shake. Rafael let the silence sit for a moment. Then he played the audio from a patio conversation, Isabela's clipped voice and the shadowed male response. The sound was muffled, but the cadence pulled the word Marcos into Rafael's awareness as if someone had tapped him hard. Gasps threaded around the table. Isabela's jaw fell. Color drained from her face as if the lights had been turned down. Rafael did not accuse yet. He watched Marcos more than he watched Isabela. He wanted to see whether the friendship would stand or collapse under illumination. Marcos swallowed. He looked at Rafael, then at Isabela. There was a fissure the size of a continent in his expression, an instant where the man's calm dropped into a different gravity. Isabela's face flamed, and she rose in a gesture that had the old, rehearsed polish. She began, with a voice rifled through indignation, to explain. "This is," she started, and then stopped, because the room was already working against her. Faces, questions in the eyes, the sound of plates set down. She reached for an argument practiced for social audiences, one that would paint her as the one wronged by invasion. But Rafael had not invited his mother, his friends, his confidants to list grievances. He had invited them to see truth. At that exact moment, when the story had turned from surveillance to spectacle, Julia, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, kicked her foot and knocked a napkin to the floor. She looked at the video screen and then at Isabela with the blunt sincerity of a child who had not yet learned the right filters for cruelty. "Why is she mean?" she asked loudly, the question simple enough to strip away any social niceties. The room jumped. Isabela's face fell into a mask. The people who had been murmuring, who had been parsing the evidence in whispers, began to talk in louder, more pointed syllables. Dona Helena's hand went to her mouth. "This is vile," a cousin said, the word sharp as a knife. Rafael's heart was a drum. He had wanted the truth and now faced its form in the middle of candles and dessert forks. He had expected anger, perhaps. He had not expected the particular pain that cut something out of you in such a public place. The realization that betrayal is sometimes performed with the ease of a social routine. Then Isabela, flustered and defeated, stood and did something Rafael had not scripted. She moved toward the doorway as if to call for privacy, and in the movement the light caught her hand, curved, a little swollen at the knuckle. She pressed the palm to her stomach the way someone might hold a secret inside. For a moment no one spoke. The room orbited that small, sudden admission. "Isabela," Dona Helena said finally, her voice low and authoritative, "are you carrying a child?" Isabela's eyes darted to Marcos at the far end of the table. For the first time that evening, the name was not merely a whisper on a tape, but a live accusation in the room. Marcos pushed his chair back as if the ground had given way beneath him. He put his hands on the table and stood. "I can explain," he said. "Explain what?" Rafael asked. His voice was quieter than he expected, but it had a raw edge to it. The questions he had rehearsed suddenly seemed blunt and inadequate. He had imagined a single betrayal, indifference toward the babies. He had not fully allowed his mind to hold the particular cruelty of connection, a friend's involvement in a woman he had tried to protect. Isabela, understanding for the first time that the next words might change everything, did not answer. Her silence opened a gap. Someone else at the table tried to fill it with a defense. One of Isabela's friends began counting the ordinary complexities of relationships like an accountant balancing a ledger. But the ledger would not balance here. The camera feed had already arranged the facts into a narrative that no one in the room wanted to ignore. Marcos's face turned to Rafael with an expression so split it made Rafael's stomach drop. He looked like a man acutely aware of a line he had crossed and the ruin it caused by doing so. "Raf," he said, using a name he had used for 20 years as if it were a rope to hold on to. "This isn't how you should find out." Rafael stepped closer, so close that the space between them felt electric. The chandelier hummed above them with quiet light. He did not yet shout. He did not need to. The silence gathered witnesses. "I asked you to be my friend," Rafael said, the sentence small but full of everything a friendship had meant. "I asked you to be at my side. You were at my side when things were hard. I thought we were honest." Marcos touched his phone as if preparing a defense he knew would fail. "Raf, it wasn't supposed to." "Wasn't supposed to?" The words were brittle now, flung like glass. "You were never supposed to be in my family's room with my children as anything but a guest." Isabela finally spoke. Her voice was uneven, raw, and somehow perfunctory. "It's complicated," she said. "Marcos and I—" She stopped, as if the rest of the explanation existed on a page she had not yet learned how to read. The room pressed in with questions that had no answers. Rafael's mother sat very still, watching the two men with an expression that betrayed generations of expectation and disappointment. Marina had come forward, tiny and resolute, with Julia gripping at her sleeve. She looked at the scene with a sort of sacred horror, not because there was spectacle, but because she understood the consequences, children's lives rearranged by grown people's choices. No one moved to strike the first blow. It was as if everyone, unconsciously, had stepped back to let the truth speak for itself. And in that brief span, the truth took the shape of a woman whose hand kept drifting to a place no one had the authority to touch, but everyone now had a right to question. Rafael did not know whether to call his lawyer then, to ask for a private conversation, to make threats, to ask for the exact kind of legal protections that cleanly severed messy human entanglements. Instead, he stood there, feeling both like the accused and the interrogator, and watched the one person he had considered family look at him with a face no longer uncomplicated. Marcos's next words fell like a stone into a still well. "Yes," he said. "Yes, I—" His voice crumbled, and then, with a clarity that suggested a man trying to limit the damage by telling the truth himself, he added, "I'm the one." The sound of it, so small and precise, made the room breathe out collectively, as if a curtain had been pulled aside, and a view of everything had been exposed. Rafael felt as though the air had left his body. The betrayal was no longer a shadow. It had a name, a voice, and a body sitting across from him. Isabela's face did not show triumph or fear. It showed something simpler, a relief that the secret had been spoken. Marina looked at Marcos as if trying to read whether he had known the children had found in him a potential dangerous tenderness. Marcos looked back at her, and then at the floor, a man suddenly too old for the jokes he used to tell, and not old enough to have learned the price of his mistakes. "And you kept this from me?" Rafael asked, and there it was again, the hurt wearing itself like a public garment. Marcos swallowed and tried to say what men say when they are cornered by the consequences of being small in a big life. "I thought it was right to protect her. I didn't know how to tell you." "Protect her?" Rafael's laugh was a jagged sound that did not belong to him. "From what, Marcos? From a life with my children?" People clustered around, offering fragmented moralities. Some accused Marcos of cowardice. Others tried to protect the privacy of a woman they had liked in other contexts. But none of it softened the blow. Rafael felt his world recalibrate in a heartbeat. Friendship, trust, the very scaffolding of his days. The room closed in with the weight of decisions he had not yet allowed himself to imagine. He could see in the faces around him the same questions. What do you do when someone you love betrays you with someone you trusted as a brother? What authority does a man have when his family is threatened by choices that feel like an invasion rather than a misstep? And crucially, what happens to the babies who had never asked to be the center of adult sins? Marina stepped forward then, not to admonish, but because children need answers in the language adults often cannot provide. She took one of the babies and held him like a prop against the surge of unreadable emotion in the room. Her hands were steady. Her voice was small and clear. "They are sleeping," she said. "We have to keep them sleeping." Her words did something the conversation could not. They reoriented the room to the thing that mattered most. For a suspended moment, Rafael felt the pressure of everything collapsing, and the simple, sharp obligation that would guide him no matter the betrayal. But the betrayal itself had teeth, sharp, personal, and stinging, and it would not be softened by duty alone. That night, the home that Rafael had filled with the noise of children echoed with other sounds. People leaving in separate groups, words thrown like armor, the soft staccato of shoes on tile. Isabela walked out with a small bag of things she had brought, expecting a future of photographed engagements and congratulatory gloss. Marcos stayed, perhaps because he feared where else to go, or because leaving felt like an admission beyond the one he had already made. Rafael spent the rest of the night trying to catalog what had just happened. There were images on the screen he had watched. There were words that still tasted like salt. He thought of Clarissa at her small, unadorned grave and the promise he had made to her. He thought of Marina and Julia and the way a child's simple question could cleave through a room full of grown people's complexities. When dawn came, it found him awake in a study that smelled like the last night's wine. He watched the light move across the floor and wondered how many small betrayals stack before you cannot see the original foundation. He thought, as men do in those quiet hours, of what he needed next. Not revenge, not even certainly forgiveness, but a plan that would protect the 3 small lives he had sworn to keep. He called his lawyer, who advised separation of duties and quick consultations with a family counselor and a private investigator who could, if necessary, corroborate whether the relationship extended beyond the social sphere. "You're not asking the right question," the lawyer said. "This is not about scandal. It's about custody and safety. If we need to make a case for guardianship or restrict contact, you'd better be ready with documentation." Rafael bristled at the word guardianship. He had already taken these children into his home, but the law expected processes, signatures, and time. He had to move with both speed and legal prudence. The lawyer spoke of affidavits, of family court procedures that could be invoked if someone tried to claim parental rights, and of the importance of not appearing vindictive should the matter shift into public scrutiny. The legal language put distance between him and the raw wound of betrayal. It made the pain manageable in the nihilistic way bureaucracy sometimes does, one box checked at a time. While the lawyer spoke, Rafael replayed other small tapes in his head. Isabela's complacent touch, Marina's soft humming, Marcos's small looks. There was a pain that belonged to someone betrayed, and a different pain belonged to someone confronting the possibility that their most trusted ally had been secretive in ways that reshaped the meaning of loyalty. Outside, the city rolled on. A child cried in an alley, a siren passed. People began their days as if nothing had happened in the Mendonça house. Inside, Rafael realized that his life had shifted along a new axis. What he had believed would be a private injury had become a public ledger. There would be consequences, decisions, and reconfigurations. There would also, he knew, be an irreducible human cost. The possibility that a friend's mistake would leave a wake long and terrible enough to touch the baby's futures. He considered forgiveness, but he could not get there from the rawness of the morning. He thought of Marina, of how she had tended those children without questions, and felt a fierce urge to make things right for her and for Julia. He considered making the home more legal than emotional for a while. Contracts written not to cold the place, but to redeem it from the uncertainty Isabela's presence had introduced. The day stretched, and the house hummed with a quiet recovery. Marina arranging bottles by the sink, Julia playing quietly with a wooden truck, Donna Helena sitting in the living room holding a photograph of Clarissa and tracing the edges as if she could redraw fate. Rafael sat at his desk and wrote notes on a pad, the sort of lists he used to tame business turmoils: lawyer to call, private investigator to hire, a secure schedule for visits. He added one more item at the top: protect the children. He could not imagine at that moment how hard protecting them would be. He could not imagine how the choices of 2 grown people would throw the private geography of his family into disarray. But he did know one thing like a fact: the world had changed. The cameras had done their job. The truth had been exposed. He also knew that this exposure had introduced a new, thornier kind of danger. The idea that the father of Isabela's unborn child could be Marcos, his friend, was not merely a betrayal. It was a collapse of the map he had used to navigate his life. It required more than a decision about who lived where. It required him to decide what kind of man he would be in the face of broken trust. He would need allies. He would have to think not only like a businessman, but like a father and like a juror of his own life. The decisions ahead would be public, procedural, and moral. They would not be tidy. Rafael stared at the place on his desk where Clarissa's promise had been written in his notes months earlier, and in the margin he scribbled the only plan that presently made sense: to protect the 3 small lives at all cost, even if the cost meant severance and solitude, even if the price was an old friend's disgrace. Outside the window, the morning had brightened to a merciless clarity, the kind that shows every detail without mercy. Inside, the house dialed itself to a new frequency. The cameras sat silent in the corners, their lenses reflecting the morning like unblinking eyes. They had given him the truth. Now it was his turn to decide what to do with it. For the first week after the dinner, the Mendonça house felt like a stage just after the curtains have been hauled down. Embers of what had burned, cooling in sudden, exposed ways. People came and went with the deliberate gestures of those who must now repair practical damage. Lawyers, an investigator Rafael hired on impulse, a family counselor suggested by Dona Helena. The domestic routine, the bottles, the naps, the soft battles with diapers, continued, because children do not wait for adults to be ready. They insisted on the ordinary, and ordinary became Rafael's anchor. His lawyer, a woman named Anna who spoke in efficient sentences and wore her experience like armor, set a schedule and a list. Gather witness statements, preserve all the footage and label it. Draft an emergency petition for temporary guardianship. File for protective orders limiting contact with the children while the matter was being reviewed. The lawyer emphasized language Rafael hadn't wanted to hear but needed. Best interests of the children, reasonable cause, chain of custody. "You do not want to appear vengeful," she said, looking at him across the conference table, "but you must act urgently to seal their safety. We'll move for temporary orders right away. The footage helps. Your admission upon discovery, Marcos's statement. If the father has not sought paternity recognition yet, that complicates nothing for our petition. The court can act on the risk and on the proof of neglect or intent to abandon." Rafael listened the way men who run companies listen when the word risk is used. He had led negotiation rooms where human lives were only line items. This felt altogether worse because the line items were flesh and breath. He signed the retainer, making the legal steps real. Marina watched the law work like a foreign language. She had never been to a firm with oak tables and degrees on the wall. Her life had been measured in morning shifts, school lunches, and a small apartment 2 neighborhoods away. Yet she now found herself sitting with Anna, a copy of a proposed contract in front of her, an offer from Rafael that both recognized the debt he felt she had incurred and began to make it lawful. "We want you to have stability," Anna said plainly. "A formal employment agreement, a salary appropriate to a manager of childcare in a household like this, a private room for you and your daughter. We'll include a clause expressing Rafael's intent to seek guardianship support and to recommend you as primary caregiver in his petition. Legally, the court will make the final decision, but showing this arrangement demonstrates the children's established routine and best interests." Marina's hand trembled when she picked up the pen. It was not because the numbers on the paper were extravagant, far from it, but because on the bottom line was a legit chance to move from precariousness into a small, real security. Julia, whose world had been uneven since the day her mother left a job to care for infants no one else could keep patient, looked up at the paper with uncomprehending satisfaction. "Are we going to have our own bedroom?" she asked. And the question made Rafael, who had engineered mergers and acquisitions with a cool hand, feel something like a father who could finally answer an honest request. He watched Marina sign. There was a cost. Placing the care of 3 babies into legal words felt bureaucratic, like boiling a thing that needed tenderness in a pot of steam. He tried to make sure the provision for emotional labor, time off, counseling, health benefits, was there, and Anna negotiated without fuss. Marina's gratitude was not gleeful, it was quiet and edged with disbelief. "You don't owe me a grand speech," she said later, when they walked through the nursery together and checked the small shelves of toys. "You did what you felt right."
"It felt right because I didn't know any other way," Rafael answered. "You taught me how to be small enough to see what they needed."
That night, after the lawyers left and the house settled into the measured breathing of infants, Rafael asked Marina to sit with him in the study. He needed to speak plainly, to lay out who she would be and what he intended to do to make it legal. "You can leave if you want," he said, before she could form the question on her lips. "You've been carrying more than you should. You don't have to stay because I asked." Marina studied him like someone who had watched storms and learned how not to stand directly in their path. "I promised Clarissa," she said, and the tiny, unadorned name was as much a prayer as explanation. "I promised her I'd keep them. I didn't promise you anything, only to keep them." Rafael felt the weight of the promise the way a pillar feels the weight of a roof. "I want to make that promise safe," he said. "I want to make sure you can do this without losing yourself. That's why I'm putting this on paper. I don't want you to be invisible because you cared." When the first court date arrived, the Mendonça home was quieter than usual. The filing for temporary guardianship was straightforward in its essentials. The petition asked the judge to grant Rafael temporary custodial authority over the 3 infants while the court examined paternity claims and parental fitness. The lawyer presented the video evidence, Marcos's admission, and witness statements. She framed it not as a battle of personalities, but as a matter of the children's safety. There had been evidence of callousness and planning that could have endangered the babies. There had been a clandestine relationship that entangled the household and threatened their stability. A careful judge noted the chain of custody and ordered a short suspension of any unsupervised contact between Isabela, Marcos, and the children until a fuller hearing could occur. It was, Rafael knew, a partial victory. The law could not change human hearts in a day, but it gave him breathing room long enough to make the next decisions. Isabela resisted at first. She hired a lawyer who spoke of privacy, of the right of biological mothers to contact their children, of the complicating factor of pregnancy. It was, the legal filings read, a messy collage. In private, she called Marcos and demanded that he stand up with her. Instead, he answered once and then stopped picking up his phone. In the social circles they had once inhabited, friends drifted like paper in a current. Some called to say they were shocked, some pretended not to know, others simply stopped returning messages. Isabela, who had always been a player in the public light, found herself suddenly unadorned. Marcos's life shifted with a more structural gravity. A shareholder meeting that week included awkward glances and a boardroom lull where the men who had once toasted him now looked for a cue to break away. One partner, someone Rafael had kept at arm's length, decided the association risk was too great and asked Marcos to step back from public engagements. He took the step as quietly as he could, but could not avoid the rumor mill's judgment. There were confrontations, private and blunt. One evening, when the stress had pressed against him like a storm, Marcos came to the house unannounced. He found Rafael in the nursery, a baby asleep across his forearm while he rocked with a tenderness that made Marcos look suddenly adolescent and exposed. "You didn't have to do this in public," Rafael said without turning. The voice was low but precise. Marcos's face was raw with a kind of remorse that had not yet found words. "I know," he said. I should have told you." He paused, and the pause contained years. "Isabela and things happened. I didn't plan for this. I fell into it because I felt—" He stopped, searching for a metaphor honest enough. "I felt I could protect her. I didn't think it would hurt anyone the way it has." "Protect her," Rafael repeated, and the words were not a question. "You think hiding it, making up secret meetings, and letting her move around in my house with my children in arms, that's protection?" Marcos's shoulders slumped. He looked at the baby in Rafael's arms like a man who had seen someone he'd harmed without wanting it. "I don't excuse it," he said. "I own it. I'll do what the law says.
I'll take the test. I'm ready to accept whatever comes. What Marcos wanted and what Rafael was willing to allow were not the same thing. For Rafael, safety was the imperative that occluded reconciliation. The betrayal of intimacy with Isabela was personal and corporate. Marcos had not only broken a friendship, he had put himself in the orbit of children who meant future obligations and present vulnerability. Trust, Rafael knew, could be rebuilt only slowly, if at all, and it would be built on concrete demonstration and painfully earned accountability, not words said in a nursery at midnight. "Take the test," Rafael said at last. "Answer for your child, but you'll wait until the court orders what must happen." The legal temporality served as a moral boundary. Marcos nodded, and in that small gesture, Rafael felt an entire relationship collapse into a few steps. The weeks that followed were heavy with paperwork and care. A private investigator Rafael had engaged dug further. Messages were traced, more photos emerged, a series of dated sightings at obscure restaurants. The evidence strengthened the legal case. Anna compiled it into an order that the judge found persuasive enough to extend temporary custody and to schedule a fuller hearing in a month. In the meantime, she requested that Marcos submit to paternity testing for the unborn child. In the world of family law, DNA tests often made things clean that gossip and good intentions could not. The pregnancy itself introduced painful intimacies into the public story. Isabela's belly grew at the same measured pace as rumors, and the city's social circuits began to reposition themselves around the new variable, her child. Some people approached the subject with mercy, others calculated social distance. For Rafael's part, the presence of the pregnancy complicated his anger. It softened the lines without erasing the consequences. There was, he realized, no way to punish the unborn child for the sins of adults. Marina, who had been living now in the small annex of the Mendonça home with Julia, navigated these changes in her own slow way. The employment papers meant a kitchen where food was not always a worry, and a nurse on call for the children. They also meant new responsibilities, live-in hours, schedules, and the emotional labor of guarding 3 small beings who now had become a public matter. She found herself tired in new ways, public responsibility layered onto private scarcity. One evening, after a day that had felt endless with scheduling and phone calls, Marina sat on the back steps and watched the children sleep through the nursery window. Julia climbed onto her lap and wrapped small arms around her mother's neck. "Is he a bad man?" the little girl asked, pointing at the darker edge of the garden where Marcos's presence still felt like a shadow. Marina kissed the top of her head. "Bad isn't simple, Juju. People make bad choices. Some choices hurt, but hurting doesn't make someone all bad. It just means they have to fix what they broke." Julia's eyes were clear and small, and unforgiving in the way only 5-year-olds can be. "Will he see the babies?" Marina's answer was practical and honest. "Not now. It's too soon. We have to keep them safe. If he wants to be their father one day, he will have to prove he can be. For now, they are ours to keep." She used ours with intent because the collective pronoun named the family they were making by work and by heart. As the court hearing approached, Rafael felt the brittle pressure of public scrutiny. A social columnist printed a discreetly sympathetic piece about the father who took in children. A gossip mill took up Isabela's downfall with a cruelty that made him think of the fine line between justice and spectacle. He tried to protect Marina and Julia from the noise. He forbade any journalists' entry. He moved the baby schedule so they were less visible. He installed tighter security and asked that interactions with non-essential visitors be limited and supervised. On the day of the more complete hearing, the courtroom smelled of paper and the quiet of people performing civic function. Anna presented the compiled evidence, the videotaped interactions demonstrating Isabela's neglect or callousness, Marcos's admission at the dinner, supplemental messages showing secrecy, and witness statements noting Isabela's remarks about wanting a different life. She argued for the right of the children to remain in the environment that had proved steady, the Mendonça home under Rafael's oversight and with Marina as their primary caregiver.
Her language was exact, measured, and, when it mattered, human. Isabela's counsel objected to some of the evidence on privacy grounds, but the judge, an older woman whose face was merciful without being sentimental, leaned on precedent. The state has an interest in a child's welfare when evidence demonstrates risk. The judge authorized continued temporary custody to Rafael and allowed visitation under strict conditions to be determined recursively. She ordered that paternity testing proceed expeditiously for the unborn child, and that the court appoint a guardian ad litem to represent the legal interests of the babies themselves. When the judge spoke the ruling, the weight of weeks fell like a hand freed from pressure. It was not a final judgment. It was an operating order that gave the children a momentary home under law and sent clear instructions for the next steps. It was as close to closure as the legal system could give in a matter awash with human error. Outside the courthouse, the press lingered, but the cameras could not catch the small domestic scene where clarity had more meaning. Rafael walking with Marina and Julia toward the cars, the babies bundled in their arms, and Dona Helena waiting with a thermos of soup in her bag because habits of care outlive headlines. The old woman's stare at Rafael was steady. She said nothing, only placed her hand briefly on his arm as if to transmit a benediction and a caution. In the weeks after the hearing, the immediate chaos dulled into a new routine. Marina's official contract was honored. She received a regular pay stub, health benefits began, and the annex of the house was prepared with a small bedroom for her and a patchwork of children's drawings taped to the wall. Julia's school enrollment was handled. She was now technically a child of the household, with a place at the breakfast table and a small stack of bedtime stories. Rafael began funding a trust for the baby's future, a practical step teachers and heads of firms recommend when the adult world needs to be transformed into safety for children. Marcos submitted to the paternity test with the mechanic's resignation of a man who has lost more than a relationship. The sample was taken in a sterile room under conditions the lab requested. He waited in a small chair, hands clenched, while the bureaucratic machinery turned in its usual unromantic way. When the results came back, they confirmed what the tapes and the confession had already made likely. He was the biological father of Isabela's child. The confirmation did not simplify anything. It forced the obligations into the open. Legally, Marcos now had responsibilities that could not be avoided by leaving social circles. He was required to negotiate child support, custody for the newborn, and, if the mother desired, visitation. Psychologically, the confirmation made the betrayal a thing with its own legal name. His sense of shame widened, and with it, a practical plan was needed. He met with his lawyer. He met with Rafael once more, in a space less theatrical than the nursery. Rafael's old office, with a view of the city that had been the backdrop to friendship and deals. There, stripped of the dinner's watchful eyes, the two men tried to articulate what had not been possible in the public scene. "I will provide for my child," Marcos said, voice grimed by responsibility. "I will not hide from that, but I cannot ask for forgiveness, Raf, not now." "How do you propose to start fixing this?" Rafael asked, steady but not unkind. The question was practical as ever. Restitution has a form. Financially, legally. I'll set up accounts for the child. I'll agree to supervised visitation if that's what the court says. I'll step down from certain public roles until it's squared away. His fingers drummed on the arm of the chair. "It's the least I can do." Rafael considered the options. Revenge could be cold and final. Cut off every tie. Treat the man as if he had never existed. But that was a life shaped by absolute responses. The man across from him was still the one who had laughed with him in the earliest bankruptcy fights, the one who had helped him wire funds in the first shaky days of a venture, the one whose history was tangled with decades of shared mistakes and small mercies.
Rafael understood that the law could secure safety. The law could also stipulate the terms of restitution without demanding that he pretend pain did not exist. "Do it," Rafael said finally. "Do what the court requires. If you want to be part of your child's life, do it under whatever conditions protect our children. You will not be near the triplets until the court allows it and until you've shown concrete, sustained steps." Marcos nodded. It was not a path to pardon. It was, at best, a possible way out of scandal, into a different, gentler responsibility. Isabella's life went through different permutations. The city's social salons closed to her. She moved to a small apartment in a less showing neighborhood. She spent long hours on the phone with lawyers, sometimes weeping with fatigue that had nothing to do with pregnancy hormones and everything to do with consequences. She wrote a letter, publicly and privately, apologizing for the pain she had caused, but apologies do not always land where intended. For some, they are insufficient. For others, they are a first step. The court eventually granted Rafael sole temporary guardianship of the triplets, with Marina documented as their primary caregiver and recommended as the one best suited to petition for long-term guardianship. The judge's written order emphasized the children's stability and the importance of continuity of care. It did not resolve every moral question. It only provided the legal framework to protect 3 vulnerable infants while the adults untangled their mess. With the legal machinery arranged, the house returned to a more ordinary rhythm. There were still nights that tasted of salt and the residue of hurt. Marcos's apology letters, Isabella's occasional calls that Marina screened professionally, and the low murmur of worry whenever a stranger's car stopped at the gate. But the babies thrived in small, unbeatable ways. One learned to laugh with a sound that made even the hard days softer. Another grabbed the edge of a blanket with a grip that announced stubborn persistence. The third, always the sleepy one, found sugared comfort in a particular lullaby Marina hummed. There were costs. Marina's body carried fatigue like a map of long days, and sometimes the nights gave her a sleep so thin she feared she might unthread. The money Rafael provided improved their life. The annex became warmer, the grocery list no longer a source of stress. But the weight of guardianship hung real and heavy. It was not romance. It was work that asked questions about time and limits, and Marina confronted them honestly. She took counseling offered by the family's therapist, who taught techniques to deal with guilt and stress, and affirmed that accepting help did not mean betraying the memory of Clarissa. Dona Helena, who had been a quiet but unrelenting presence, became exactly what Rafael needed: a moral compass with the bluntness of someone who had seen enough life not to confuse liking with duty. She visited the nursery in the early mornings to fold clothes and to read to the babies in a voice that could change mood. Her approval of Marina, expressed in small gestures, a slice of cake on the counter, a knitting thread left on a tiny sweater, meant for Marina a kind of legitimacy that the law could not confer. There were days of small public reparation after months of private work. Marcos, restricted to delivering financial support and limited supervised visits, agreed to a mediated meeting with Rafael. They met in the garden where the dinner had once become a tribunal. This time, words were meant not to cut but to set parameters. "I didn't consider how deep the harm would be," Marcos said. "I thought I was saving someone in the wrong way. I kept clinging to a foolish idea that mercy sometimes looks like secrecy. It was cowardice." Rafael watched the man who had once been his closest ally and saw the rawness under years of shared jokes. "You weren't protecting anyone," Rafael said. "You were hiding something that would have made everything worse. You'll have to live with that. But you will also, if you want, have to live with the consequences of choosing to be present for your child." Marcos bowed his head. "I will do whatever it takes." "Then begin with truthfulness and continue with responsibility," Rafael told him. "And understand, you are not negotiating your way back into my life.
You are negotiating your responsibilities to a child. The months stretched into a new shape. The newborn Isabela, carried to term, became a small, uncomplicated life, whose arrival softened no one's earlier errors, and yet demanded attention on its own terms. Marcos visited under supervision, and, awkward at first, brought a small knitted hat. Isabela, thin from nights of feeding and from the public solitude that trailed her like a shadow, held the child with both tenderness and an exhaustion that had no eloquent name. The baby's breath was private and unpunctuated by other people's judgments. People in the house learned to treat the infant the way caring adults should treat any human being, with careful regard and practical support. Rafael, who had imagined some roles for himself, guardian, protector, provider, found himself shaping a different definition of family. He thought often of the promise he had made at Clarissa's grave, and of the one he had made, less formally, to Marina and Julia when the house's weight had been the greatest. He realized that family was not an arrangement of bloodlines, but a set of choices: to be present, to protect, to steward. He began to see the trio of infants not as a single burden, but as a small constellation, each requiring its own attention. There were small, almost ordinary moments that anchored him. He learned a lullaby Marina hummed, a line of melody that the babies liked and that he could sing without embarrassment. He read to them in the evenings, fumbling over small syllables, learning the cadence of their tiny faces. He taught them to hold their own spoons, to reach for a toy, to put a chubby fist over his finder. Each small victory offered a quiet recompense. Marina's life also changed outside of the house. With a steady salary, she enrolled in night classes, an administrative certificate program that would allow her more options later. Julia attended summer camp for the first time and came home glowing. Marina sometimes felt guilty for leaving her children to the care routines she had set, but she understood the logic of investing in herself so she could better care for them. The law had granted temporary structures. She now planned for permanency. There were still stinging edges. At a social event months later, a small gathering for a charity Rafael supported, someone asked casually, as if discussing whether the scandal of the dinner had damaged his reputation. Rafael met the question with a quiet he had learned to reserve for those who ask of others what they themselves would not give. "My reputation matters less than whether those 3 boys have a steady bed and whether their needs are met," he said, and the answer shifted the room's perspective a little. Marcos's public life never regained its earlier ease. He fulfilled his financial obligations, making payments into an account for the infant's care and contributing to a fund for medical expenses. He made supervised visits and, awkwardly at first, learned how to make small but sincere gestures: a toy left on a supervised visit, a letter of apology to the children when he realized the shape of his responsibility. Those gestures were modest and could not wash away the past, but for a child they would be memories not of the scandal, but of a man who showed up imperfectly and tried. As a final legal matter, Rafael filed for a petition recommending Marina as the children's permanent guardian. The judge reviewed the children's ongoing stability, the love and continuity they had in the Mendonça home, and the efforts the adults had made to correct the course. The court looked at the social worker's reports, the therapist's recommendations, and the fact that Marina had established a stable routine and a clear relationship of care. The judge did not make the permanent guardianship instant. These things took time, but she granted a recommendation that carried weight. The law, in the end, was cautious, but caution, Rafael found, felt like mercy when it protected the vulnerable. The social penalties on Isabela trickled rather than ended abruptly. She kept the child but lived a life distant from the circles she once occupied. There were days when she called, asking about the triplets in a voice that was both wounded and plaintive. Marina handled the calls with the measured kindness of someone who had more to lose than to gain. There were no grand reconciliations. There were only the slow human measures of a life rearranged, some days better, some days worse. 6 months from the dinner, the Mendonça house had the kind of sound only a family can make, the low rumble of sleep and the sudden peal of infant laughter, a kettle whistling, a radio playing a soft station, the slap of little feet. The babies had small teeth. One had learned to say a syllable that sounded like Rafael's name, and the sound made him stumble in the best way. Marina had a small certificate in progress and a bed that did not feel like precarious shelter. Yulia had a new school uniform and an unapologetic appetite for life. On a bright weekend, Rafael arranged something small and private, a visit to Clarissa's grave. He had not wanted to turn the pilgrimage into a pageant for the board of directors. It was, for him, necessary to keep a promise. Marina and Julia came, along with Dona Helena, and Marina carried one of the babies in a sling while Rafael held the others, clumsy as he was with tiny fingers. The sky was open and indifferent. A wind came like a small benediction. Rafael knelt and smoothed his hand over the stone. "I promised," he said aloud, the words simple and rooted in the same soil that had held Clarissa. "I promised to keep them." His voice broke, not in theatrical pain, but as a man who was learning the limits of control and the possibilities of steady work. Marina stepped forward and laid a small toy beside the stone, a wooden truck painted blue. "We kept them," she said, and the pronouns stitched them into a kind of family by will. Julia, solemn in a way that outpaced her age, put a hand on the stone. Donna Elena, who had lived long enough to know that life's accidents require constant tending, said a quiet prayer. The sound was private and truthful. For all the legal orders and headlines, for all the painful severances and hard days, the small, unremarked continuity mattered the most. Meals had been made, nappies changed, names had been said kindly. Rafael left the cemetery with a simpler ledger. There would be costs ahead, legal and emotional. There would be nights when he would be tired and angry. There would be days when forgiveness felt impossible. But there would also be mornings when a baby laughed and the sound reset everything. His choice, made months earlier at a graveside and again in a blue-lit nursery, was to keep showing up. That was the only defense he could afford against the memory of betrayal. Marcos's life remained in partial exile. He was present for the child he fathered, but constrained in ways the law required and the moral order demanded. He worked quietly on repair, payments, supervised visits, and the slow rectifications of someone who had misused intimacy. He did not ask for Rafael's friendship again. Instead, he pursued a different path, a father who learned to live with the cost of his choices. Isabella's child grew in a small apartment, loved in the way a mother makes room for a newborn. The child's life would not erase the past. It would only assert its own small presence and need. The adults around that child, when possible, chose to keep harm to others minimal and to acknowledge the children's right to safety. The Mendonça home, by contrast, became something chosen. It was not a perfect kingdom repaired by a single act of revelation. It was an ordinary, complicated household that had elected to hold 3 lives with care. Rafael learned to be less certain, to accept that human life would surprise and wound him. Marina learned, in return, to ask for help and to see that duty could be recognized both in law and in love. Julia grew up in the house with new confidence and a cheeky habit of stealing the remote when adults were not looking. In a small way, the scandal had revealed what each person had been hiding from themselves. Isabella's hunger for status without the will to accept the labor of parenthood. Marcos's cowardice masked as protection.
Rafael's belief that evidence alone would cure what was aching. Marina's quiet resourcefulness that the world had failed to value. The truth had been costly, but it had been clarifying. Months after the judge's order, there came a quiet day when the three small boys tumbled at the feet of adults who had once been strangers to one another's real needs. They were boisterous and messy and impossibly human. Rafael watched them and felt a softness that had nothing to do with the market or the ledger. He sat beside Marina at the kitchen table and quietly placed his hand over hers. "We did right," he said. Marina looked at him, then at the children, then at the small band of family who had steadied them. Donna Helena, Julia, and Rafael's distant but loyal house staff who had been transformed into guardians by practice. "We did what we had to," she corrected gently. "We kept them." There was a difference in the words. One suggested righteousness, the other suggested work. Rafael was learning that his role was less to be righteous than to be responsible. On the quiet evening when the city's lights began to dot the skyline, Rafael sat in the nursery and hummed the lullaby Marina had taught him. The melody was simple, imperfect when sung by him, but the babies were soothed. Marcos, when he came for a supervised visit years later, would recognize in their faces a life he had not ruined completely. He would be allowed, slowly and under terms set by the court, to meet the child he had fathered. That would not erase his wrongdoing. It would, perhaps, be part of a long procedural humility. The house, at the end of the long season of exposure and rebuilding, had the look of something that had been salvaged by steady hands. It still bore the memory of broken trust. The lines in Rafael's face, the times Marina looked too tired, the absence of laughter from certain rooms. But it also bore new things. A contract signed at a lawyer's office that made a life secure. A small bedroom painted for Julia. A trust fund with a modest balance that would keep the baby safe through early childhood. A daily routine that made things less precarious. Rafael kept the cameras in place for a while, not as instruments of accusation, but as reminders of how fragile assumptions could be. He learned to sleep in the way of men who had learned the true cost of care, with vigilance tempered by the gentle tasks of each morning. He learned that keeping a promise was less a single heroic act and more 1,000 small, unglamorous choices. When the house was still and the baby slept, Rafael sometimes sat by the window and thought of the long list of things he couldn't control. There were countless transgressions human beings would make, and the only real response that sustained life was to choose what to protect. He had protected 3 infants. He had lost a friend. He had given Marina a chance at stability. He had set conditions that would not be easily revoked. He had, in that unromantic ledger, created a family by choice. On the anniversary of Clarissa's death, quiet, private, Rafael and Marina and Julia and Donna Elena gathered at the small grave and left a handmade wreath. The gesture was small and private, as all true mourning must be. Rafael spoke only a few words, mostly to himself, and then they left, carrying a toy and a quiet contentment that resembled hope. The world would, of course, keep moving. New scandals would make the papers, new decisions would press on the living. But in the Mendonça house, a simple truth had been carved by ordeal. Family could be chosen and rebuilt when those who had the means used them to protect those who did not. The recovery would be long. The wounds sometimes never heal fully. But 3 small boys grew up with a steady bed, food in their bellies, and adults who had sworn, in sunlit afternoons and in private offices, to keep them. If there was a single lesson Rafael carried forward, it was this. Protection is not merely a device of money. It is an ethic that requires being present and accountable. The cameras had shown him the truth. His choice after the cameras, that he would act to keep the children's lives intact, was the thing that reconfigured his world. And though he had once imagined a life arranged by certainty, he now understood that certainty was a fragile thing. The better steadiness, he discovered, was the kind built by repeated, sometimes boring acts of care. He would, for the rest of his life, be counted by how often he chose those acts. If you stayed with this story to the end, share it with someone who believes family is what we make it to be, and subscribe for more tales where choices, not bloodlines, define the people we become.